In this lesson, we'll set up the materials and the textures for our smoke particles. Alright, so now that we have the basic emission and the motion of these particles set up, what we'll start to do now is begin applying materials and textures to these different facing pieces of geometry, and really just start to give these more the appearance of some kind of smoke or dust that would be kicked up from these engines. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just start by pressing the M key on my keyboard to open up the material editor. And we can start with just something like a standard material, so I'll just click and drag this out. Alright, so if we scroll down, we should have some maps in here that are specifically meant for the particles. So if we drop in this particle age, and I'll start by just dropping this straight into the self-illumination tab. Alright, and we'll go ahead and just double click on this material, turn on our self-illumination checkbox. And for now, I'll just take the ambient and diffuse and just bring these down to black. So essentially, now we can use this particle age to actually shade our particles based on when they're born and when they die. So just so we can actually see this, I'm just going to come in and very quickly set up a few very bright colors in here. So some different colors that will very strongly contrast each other, just so we can make sure that this is working properly. Alright, and now we can take this, take our material, just click on the output, and drag that right onto our particles. Now let's go ahead and render this and make sure everything is working properly. Alright, and you can see everything does seem to be working. So we transition from this green, and then gradually start to transition into this orange color, which will then transition out into this kind of a blue color that I have set up. All right, now really I've done this just to make sure that this shader is working properly and that everything looks at least good from a starting point. So now let's come in and actually start to give this something that is going to be much more like a smoke type material. So what we can actually start to do is with these particle age slots, we can start to plug in textures and things like that. So let's start with something like the gradient. Just drop this in. And if I double click on the actual swatch itself, I can expand this to a larger view. So if I double click on this gradient and just scroll down, I'm going to switch this to a radial gradient. Right now we can essentially start to use this gradient now as a transparency mask. So if I were to take this and connect this into something like opacity and render this out, you can see the result that we get does start to introduce a little bit of transparency, but in my case it's actually not working properly. That texture is not being mapped properly onto these different pieces of geometry. So anytime you're going to be using this facing geometry type, and if you want to connect some kind of a material texture onto this, what we first need to do is go into the actual material itself and make sure we enable this face map option. And that way we can make sure that any textures will get properly mapped onto those different pieces of geometry. So let's go ahead and re-render this. And now you can start to see that we're getting something that is quite a bit more interesting, where now because of this mask here, essentially now any part of this that is black will be treated as transparent, and the center parts will be treated as being opaque. So now we can start to begin blocking off those harsh corners that we had before and start getting something that is much more soft and kind of smoke-like. Now at the moment you can see it is very soft, but with any kind of a real smoke, you're probably going to start to have some patterns and other irregularities in this. So let's now start to take this gradient and begin adding some irregularity. So if we double click on this, you can see this centermost color of white is going to be color 3. So let's take color 3. We'll take this port, just click and drag out. We'll connect in a standard noise map. There we are. Now if we double click on this, we can start to introduce maybe just a little bit more noise and a little bit more irregularity into this. So let's switch this to something like a fractal, so that way we can start to get a little bit more noise in here. We can also start to adjust the high and low values in this if we want to start to add more contrast. So as we start to adjust these and kind of bring these together, just kind of softening that out a little bit. Okay, now we do still have this very smooth halo around this outer portion, so let's do the same for color 2. Let's just click and drag out, go to standard, and we'll plug in another noise map for that as well. There we are. Now again, we can start to switch this to something like a fractal, or in this case, maybe even a turbulence noise. And again, just playing with some of these different high and low values until we start to introduce the amount of contrast that we want. All right, so let's see what that does for us. And now you can definitely start to see a little bit more of that irregular patterning in here. Now in my case, some of this noise patterns may be a little bit too fine. So what I might try to do is go into this noise map itself. So just double click on that and maybe try to eliminate a little bit of this noise and some of these high patterns that we have in here. So maybe come in here and start to drop my levels down a little bit more. We can also start to adjust the size of this if we want to start to capture more or less detail. So maybe starting to bump up that size a little bit more. All right, and let's re-render that. All right, and you can see that is now starting to give me still some irregularity, but as far as the overall patterns in there, they're just now a little bit softer and a little bit more difficult to make out, which is really kind of what I'm trying to go for in this case. So now that we have just a decent starting point for the overall shading of these particles as far as their overall opacity and starting to get some nice irregular patterns in the opacity, what we'll start to focus on in our next lesson is the actual coloration of these particles and starting to make this look a little bit more like realistic smoke or dust.